Hello and welcome to a new episode of SPC Conversations. My name is Greg Gross, and I serve as Vice President and a member of the Board of Directors of Solidarity with the Persecuted Church. SPC's mission is to help the Christian Church persevere in areas of the world where it faces religious persecution, working with local church leaders to promote sustainability, resist persecution, and increase awareness of their plight here in the United States and in other countries in the West. We are delighted to have as our guest my dear friend, the Reverend Canon Alistair Macdonald-Radcliff. Thank you, Alistair, for joining us.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you again. I've long valued our friendship, and I look forward to conversing as we shall today.
Yes, likewise. I look forward to the conversation. And let me give a bit of a background for Alistair. This is a remarkable background of decades of experience working all over the world on so many issues that are impacted by the worries of SPC and the concerns and programs of SPC. Alistair first studied ancient history and philosophy before taking advanced degrees in philosophy of religion and theology, studying in London, Oxford, and Yale, where he was a research fellow, and also studied Islam. It took a degree in international relations. After ordination, he worked on international and development issues before working for Lord Carey, the 103rd Archbishop of Canterbury, and being appointed senior advisor to the World Economic Forum, where he designed the Council of 100 Leaders West Islamic Dialogue. He was also later appointed to be senior advisor to the King Abdullah Dialogue Center in Vienna, known by the acronym KAICIID. He also served as Dean of All Saints Cathedral in Cairo, Egypt, where he has worked extensively on interfaith matters as well as sustainable development. He has thus been based in the Middle East, Europe, and North America, where he was recently called to be the 17th rector of the Church of the Advent in Boston. So, Alistair, I'd like to begin with your extensive background in dealing with these broad issues around the world. Let's talk more broadly about the issue of persecution of the church, the Christian church in the world at large. Describe what is happening to us, and also what is the Anglican Communion doing about this issue?
Well, the story of persecuted Christians is a very large and sadly long one, with the broad picture being something that often people overlook, which is to say that the greatest number of martyrs has been in the modern world rather than the ancient world, as we often think. And the story of persecution of Christians is a worldwide challenge. And that's something which the Anglican Communion has definitely run into and encounters. We are about 85 million Anglicans worldwide, but we are across 41 provinces. And so we have a global reach. And many of those provinces are affected. We have 11 provinces across the whole of Africa, as well as the provinces in the Middle East, notably the province in which I served, the province of now Alexandria, which covers North Africa, the Horn of Africa, and Egypt. We also have a province in India, North and South India, and Pakistan, which would be another example of places where this sort of issue is very pressing. So the reality of persecution is one that we deal with across the communion. It's not a matter that we don't have a dedicated task force on that. So it's something we deal with as part of the agenda for our international meetings. We have, of course, every 10 years, the Lambeth Conference, and the continuing body in between those conferences, which looks after international matters for us, which is the Anglican Consultative Council. These all deal with these matters on a regular basis, as does the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so these matters are quite pressing for us and are often raised. But in terms of the higher profile areas, I would have said that from my own experience, the interface between Islam and Christianity in Nigeria, in Tanzania, for example, in Africa, would in both cases be a very pressing one, and we'll probably come back to Nigeria. It's also an issue across the Middle East, of course, because Christians are in a minority context there. And that means that there are often challenges. And that's very true in Egypt. It has to be said that the Egyptian government is striving very hard to do what it can to protect minorities. And that was the context in which there was quite a sense of relief for the Christians, all kinds of other issues about how that all unfolded. But when the Morsi administration fell, there was definitely a sense among Christians that they were likely to be better off under the current government than they would have been with that more Islamist alternative. That's not to say in the case of Egypt that everything's absolutely wonderful. There are a lot of points of friction, and those go back a long way. Indeed, some of the legislation that affected the church goes back. It's now been reformed recently, but the legislation, for example, preventing you from building new churches or restoring old ones went back all the way to the Ottomans. So that's a legacy that's perhaps unexpected. But again, we don't know exactly how many Christians there are in Egypt. That points to an interesting dynamic, which you find in some countries they don't want to count very accurately. There's certainly a perception that perhaps the government underreports the number of Christians, but be that as it may, it's often in rural places or places of economic deprivation where you've got communities cheek by jowl with each other that you can have friction, and there can then be specific instances surrounding conversion. Was it forced? If someone wants to convert from Islam to Christianity, that's usually extremely problematic, and that can lead to all kinds of very serious life-threatening issues. So in the context of Egypt, but overall, to take the example of the law on building or restoring churches, that's been changed recently. So now it's possible. At one time, it took up to 30 years to get permission to build a new church. And I remember a case many years ago when I was in Egypt, where a priest had been arrested by the police in the middle of the night for restoring his church. It was a Coptic priest. And it became quite a cause célèbre because he was put in the back, bundled into the back of a vehicle, and it was run down a sharp hill, and he was killed. The police eventually were persuaded to investigate, and the Anglican Archbishop was part of that motivating process, that he encouraged that to go forward. So there's a sense there in which Anglicans, because in a way we're so small in Egypt, we're very unthreatening, but we have extensive international connections, and that therefore allowed us to play a role in that conflict. That situation, it wasn't a wider conflict, but it was certainly a very tense interfaith moment, which was positive. But we are definitely aware of the reality of persecution and indeed the reality of people being killed. That can flare up very rapidly with great effect in places like Nigeria. I knew quite well the Archbishop of Kaduna, who became the General Secretary of the Anglican Consultative Council and therefore was active worldwide. Josiah Adeowo Firon, and he served in an international capacity of the Anglican Church, but before that had been the Bishop of Kaduna, and in that capacity he would regularly say that there would be riots. And I remember in one instance there were riots one moment, and a particular flashpoint occurred, and several hundred, I think it was 300 people were killed on that one occasion. And that's a feature in Nigeria more regularly. There have been attacks, particularly at Easter and Christmas. I think last Christmas there were several hundred people killed in different parts of Nigeria because of attacks from extremists. So, as I say, the reality of persecution is very much a present one across the communion. Again, I have visited Pakistan, and I remember there the very, very difficult circumstance where there's a lot of tension. There are incursionary forces. You get allegations made in particular there of blasphemy. That legislation goes back to Zia al-Haq, who brought forward that legislation. It's been used. There have been over 2,000 cases since that legislation was brought forward where people were arrested, put in prison, had to stand trial. Sometimes that process could take years, and sometimes they would simply be lynched before that ever happened. So that blasphemy issue is a very big one in Islamic countries. It plays a role also in Nigeria, and that's a factor we have to think about as well.
Right. And as you know, Nigeria is perhaps, I think it's fair to say even today, it's probably the most lethal place to be a Christian in the entire world. And as we discussed before in our many conversations over the years, especially recently, we've been focused on Nigeria at Solidarity with the Persecuted Church. And we're going to be sending a team there led by our president, Steve Wagner, to actually investigate and talk to people of different denominations, because Nigeria is fascinating because unlike many places where Christians are persecuted, Christians make up nearly half of the population. And when you look at the panoply of denominations that are present in Nigeria, it really is a window into the entire world of Christian interdenominational relationships. And the Catholic Church, I think, and the Anglican Church are the largest two there. I think it's many millions of both. But why don't you talk about Nigeria specifically? Describe the presence of the Anglican Church there, and what is the circumstance of Anglican Christians in Nigeria?
Well, my connection to the Nigerian Anglican Church goes back all the way to 1998, when I remember becoming quite acquainted before that conference. And I'm speaking there of the Lambeth Conference, which I mentioned before. We have that roughly every 10 years. And that was a gathering of the bishops from across the Anglican Communion. And on that occasion, it was Archbishop Detiloye who represented, with his bishops, the delegation from Nigeria. And that led me to become aware of just how big the Anglican Church is in Nigeria. It's probably one of the largest, if not the largest, provinces in the world of the Anglican Communion, aside from Britain or aside from the United Kingdom. And one can debate what the criterion of being an Anglican is. So that's an interesting question. But we think there are something like 20 million, or a little bit just under, Anglicans in Nigeria. So it is a very, very large church, and quite well resourced, obviously, because of the sheer scale.
One of the things that impressed me about the Anglican Church in Nigeria is the extent of active church-going participation, and maybe by that measure, it is the largest Anglican community in the world. I was very impressed with the evangelical aspect of the Anglican Church in Nigeria, going back historically. I was also interested to discover that the Christian Church, has been present in Nigeria since the 1400s. With Augustinian monks and Capuchin monks arriving in what later became the borders of Nigeria. And that does again point to the fact that the Christian presence in Nigeria is 500 plus years old, half a millennium. We find Christian persecution in places where Christians have been since the time of the apostles, and Nigeria is not quite that, but it is a very historic church going back for centuries. And I guess one of the questions I have about Nigeria and is the relationship between the denominations there. Obviously, the biggest presences are the Catholics and the Anglican Church of Nigeria. And you and I have talked in the past, for example, in the setting of Iraq, how in situations of intense Christian persecution, we over here in the United States, let's say where you are right now, I should mention you are in Boston right now speaking to us, but from the perspective of London, often people don't understand that there's a lot of denominational stuff that happens in the West. But in places like Iraq, Syria, I think it's fair to say Nigeria, but I'm curious about your perspective on this, that the denominations actually, given their circumstance, have surprisingly good relationships and cooperative relationships. So tell me a little bit about that in Nigeria.
Well, I've certainly had experience of both churches. I got to know later on, really, Cardinal Onaiyekan quite well during his time working with various international religions for peace and organizations like that, who partnered with us at CAICID, the King Abdallah Dialogue Center in Vienna, for various events. And my own experience reflects what you just say, that it's always true in areas where Christians have major issues about their presence and other faith conflicts and so on, that our own differences become less acute in terms of how we relate to each other, as we might in a predominantly Christian context. We might be more aware of some of the divisions. Those don't go away, and I think in both the case of the Anglicans and the Roman Catholics in Nigeria, they would respect the fact that they have differences theologically. But when it comes to cooperating on issues to do with persecution, I think there's a very high degree of cooperation, and most especially in the areas which are on the front line. So when you think about northern Nigeria, which is typically where these issues are most acute, I think the relationships are very cordial, and obviously have to be of immediate effect when you've got a crisis. And I've seen the same very much in the case of the Indian subcontinent. As I mentioned, in the case of Pakistan, you see that very much. They act together. And I think those relationships are very important. But they also face great problems, because obviously things will flare up. And I remember actually Archbishop Akinola was himself kidnapped at one point, which reflects the fact that you're actually perpetually in danger in Nigeria. In that instance, when the people who seized him realized quite who he was, they then rather rapidly released him, because the consequences would be quite severe. But that means he travels with, as does the current Archbishop, police protection. And that's an interesting factor. That's obviously well meant on the part of the state. But when you think about what that does to the identity of who you are as an archbishop, that's quite complicated in some ways.
One of our past guests on SPC Conversations, who's an American constitutional scholar and lawyer, an advocate before the Supreme Court, he described his first deep understanding of what was happening in Nigeria when a very prominent Nigerian priest was in the United States, yet nevertheless, even here, felt the need to have security. And so I can only imagine what it must be like in Nigeria. And again, in some ways surprising, given nearly half the population is Christian. But again, the South is Christian, the North is Islamic, and the tensions are in those border areas predominantly.
I would also point out that not all these risks are purely to do with interreligious conflict. There is a certain degree of banditry, as one would have said in times past, in Nigeria. And so I don't say that all these risks are purely to do with interfaith matters. On the other hand, I do think they can be very sharp. I can think of the case of Valentine Mkiwa, who was the Anglican Archbishop in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam. And there, the only protection he got from the government was the gift of a pistol, which he kept under his pillow at night. So his sense of being at risk was quite high, but the level of protection in that instance afforded rather low.
Well, and I think you're actually making a point, perhaps, within what you're saying, which is that whether there's an issue of radical Islamic extremism, whether it's land disputes, whether it's tribal herding land rights or whatever, in the end, Christians are being targeted specifically. And the extent of it is extraordinary. But I'm going to ask you just to move to Cairo for a moment, your experience there, because it was such an intimate experience in a place where Christians, as you know better than anyone, have had waves of persecution, sometimes even a sympathetic central government, but nevertheless, things are happening. And talk a little bit about what that was like. You obviously were dealing with the Islamic majority, imams and others within your Christian, Anglican church in Cairo. And talk a little bit about that specific experience and what that perhaps reveals to us about the broader issue of the Christian life and communities in places like Egypt.
Well, in one sense, we were a privileged community because the Anglicans that I was based obviously in Cairo, and Cairo is not typically where you are most likely to run into day-to-day conflict, whereas you can in Upper Egypt, where you have villages side by side. One would be Christian, one Muslim, and then you can have fighting or major insurrections. Flashpoints will come up, usually because there's been an allegation of a forced conversion or something like that. But in Cairo, obviously, it's very much a context where we were able to do a lot of work with major institutions of the not only the Anglican world but also the Islamic world. We had a very cordial relationship, which continues to this day, with the Azhar. And I had as one of my co-chairs when working with the World Economic Forum, the then Grand Mufti of Egypt, Ali Gouma, who remains a national figure even now in retirement. He's actually been made a member of parliament. But also Ahmed Al-Tayeb, who is the current Grand Imam, is someone I've worked with ever since I was with the World Economic Forum. At that point, he was the academic head of the Azhar, which is, of course, the premier Sunni institution of world stature, even though it was actually technically, historically, a Shia foundation, but that's going back many centuries. Now it's the #1 academic institution of the Sunni world. And at that top tier level, those relationships were very cordial and very extensive. We have a biannual formal dialogue between the Anglican Communion and the Azhar, and that would mean that there would be exchanges where they would come to visit the Lambeth Palace and we would have the Archbishop visit them. And among those experiences in particular, I remember that there was a very interesting occasion when Archbishop Rowan Williams gave an address in which he addressed how it was possible to believe in the oneness of God, but also in the Trinity. That was very interesting on a number of levels. First of all, because it challenged a convention, which is often overlooked in dialogue contexts. People often assume that we're trying to come up with some kind of syncretistic thing that we can all agree upon. Whereas in my experience, the convention is very strong that dialogue is normally about issues of shared practical concern, not about theology, because theology is felt to be too explosive. So what was interesting about the Archbishop's remarks on that occasion was that it did cause a certain amount of indigestion. And one of the things that came across was that actually seeking to explain your position in theological terms could even, to some in the Islamic world, be seen as an act of attempted evangelism, just setting it out, which is interesting. And then there were questions about their being somewhat unfamiliar with the essentially rather Greek-oriented thought background within which historically Christians have articulated notions about the Trinity and so on. So the fact that we bumped into some tensions there was quite revealing and was actually a positive thing in the longer run. Coming back to that specific point about theology not being on the agenda, one of the most interesting aspects about the way the dialogue on the ground, which is being advanced by the Anglican Church in Cairo and indeed at the cathedral, where we now have a special interfaith center, which is now headed by the former Archbishop, Archbishop Munir, is that we have a now biannual conference. It'll happen twice each year, in which we're inviting students from America, who are advanced students, to be in dialogue with students and academics at the Azhar, in which they are looking at theological matters. So I was present in the first of those exchanges, and that was the first time I'd been part of any interfaith dialogue which was actually looking at theological concepts. In other words, the concept of God. How do we approach that as Muslims and Christians? This next one, which will happen in January, and I look forward to being present for that, is going to be looking at the Sufi tradition within Islam. But that's, in other words, traditions of spirituality. But coming back from that level of dialogue, it's very important that we have high-level dialogue, because it means you can have these meetings with the Grand Imam. The Grand Imam would meet the Archbishop of Canterbury, and we would convene, as we did both at Caiceed and at the World Economic Forum, major global figures, and they would meet. That has a real impact if you can get that message conveyed in the media. The local media in the Islamic world sometimes doesn't really want to tell that story because it's seen as vaguely shocking. But as far as you get that out, that's good. However, there is a sense in which one has to ask the hard questions, which is to say, well, how does that impact people on the ground and impact the real world of conflict? And in the context, as I've said, in Egypt, if one thinks about certain subtle ways, take, for example, the wearing of headscarves. That had gone out of fashion comprehensively in Egypt, but then in the last 20 years has come back. That might not seem a major thing, but if you're a Christian woman, it becomes a very interesting point, because if you're not going to cover, it makes it very clear you're a Christian. And if you do, then what's that saying about your beliefs? Now, this comes and goes, and I remember that Ismail Siraj al-Din, a former vice president of the World Bank, who then became the head of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, an international project of its own about obviously mainly books, but nonetheless he was a major figure on interfaith matters, being a very high-level expert. He produced some photographs once of a group of women, a large group of women, photographs around the turn of the century in Cairo. They were all wearing veils, and the interesting thing was that they were actually a gathering of Copts. So you find some of these interesting things about the signals and the matters of dress and how that reflects your religious identity to be more fluid than people think. And obviously now it's a frontier issue, because we see this in the West with some people who are Muslim wanting to wear distinctive Islamic garb. And it's a bit of an issue, as I say, in Cairo. It might seem a little trivial, but there is a sense in which that speaks to your position in society. And for Christian women in Cairo, and indeed across Egypt, that's a little bit of a challenge. You can take another, which again can be more pressing. Your religious identity has typically been on your ID card. So if you wanted to change your faith, for example, that would be a major challenge. And if you presented as a Christian and then present a Muslim original ID card, that would be a trigger, because it would show you converted. And that is a problem. There is still a sense in which the historic position that someone who converts might have 3 days to repent of it and might then be liable to being killed is out there. Again, an interesting area, because I mentioned it before, Ali Guma, the Grand Mufti, wrote an article in the Washington Post in English in which he explored this question. And he made the point that there's an interesting duality in why this historical position has emerged. There's, first of all, the question of conversion, but there's behind that a presumption that you must have committed some act of blasphemy against the prophet. We're back to the blasphemy story. What he brought out by making this distinction clear was the point that, well, it might be an open question whether, in fact, by converting you'd intended or in fact had committed any act of blasphemy against the prophet. And that would therefore imply that there could be a bit of space opened up between the act of conversion and the consequence appropriate to it. That might seem a very, very careful position and very cautious given the harsh realities that we're dealing with when that comes up, of people potentially being killed. But you can see the sense in which that was a useful contribution of a very high-end figure, actually, in a sense, putting a formal opinion out there. It wasn't being called a fatwa, but essentially that's what it was. And obviously it was controversial back in Egypt, because the next day that particular piece was translated back and was available to everyone in the pages of Al-Ahram. And he had to explain and so forth, and a lot of pressure was applied, but he did not row back on the whole thing. And so that's a very modest step, but it was an important one in that continuing process of dialogue. But there is a day-to-day sense, as I say, in which Christians can feel that they have challenges in Egypt, and that remains, even though the government has been quite solidly committed to making sure that equal treatment applies to everyone. And to take another practical example, when you look at the new city being built, the new Cairo, the administrative Cairo, the government made very clear there had to be a cathedral built that was for the Copts, and there will be a Catholic cathedral, I think, as well, and we will be having churches on the Anglican side, and that was provided for from the beginning in the construction of that space. So that reflects their commitment to an Egypt which is one that has multi-faith realities that are embraced and accommodated by the state. That doesn't mean to say that all the issues have gone away. Clearly, if you're in Upper Egypt, you can feel your life is very hemmed in. If you want to convert, that's a problem. So there are some considerable challenges there. But my experience of dialogue was very positive, and I'm pleased to say that the Anglican Church, by virtue of having lots of international connections, but also being very small, was able to play quite an important role in convening interfaith dialogue, just as we also were very ecumenical.
One of the things that I think about when we talk about interfaith dialogue is in countries, for example, like Pakistan, where, as you said, it has a death penalty for conversion from Islam still in the book, on the legal books. But the dialogue, even in circumstances perhaps as egregious as that, from the standpoint of government and legal policy, having a dialogue with some of the leadership that are more sympathetic to interfaith dialogue can allow behind-the-scenes discussions that can perhaps save lives in specific instances when something happens. Even if the public nature, you can't publicize these discussions because of the circumstance, where in some cases imams would be under threat if they actually revealed the full extent of what they were discussing.
And to just give a very sharp example of that, when I was visiting my assistant actually at the World Economic Forum, was from Pakistan. I was present at her subsequent wedding, and her father, as it happened, was a leader of the opposition to Musharraf, which was very interesting. He came to the World Economic Forum, and I remember she met him at one of our breakfasts, and that was an interesting meeting. But Zaixi's Asan was a very distinguished legal figure, and her father, as I say, had a very prominent role in that area. But I went to for her wedding during or just after that wedding, when we were all in Lahore. There had been a massacre reported of Christians in a village, Gujra, and that was some way from Lahore, and it was very much publicized. What had happened was the black-clad figures had gone from house to house. They asked if they were Christian or found other evidence that they were, and burned the house down. A terrible saga. So we all went. There was an official delegation led by the Governor Taseer and the Minister for Religious Minorities, and there was quite a lot of media interest and so on. So we went to go to visit them, and I was invited along, and we saw all these burned down houses. It was all very tragic. There was a major interfaith gathering of all the local religious leaders, Muslim, Christian, and they held a big event. That was heavily covered by the media. That was all positive because the major religious figures were all able to unite. But what brought home to me the difficulties of that context was that I was flown back actually in the helicopter with Governor Taseer back to Lahore, was that the Minister for Religious Minorities and Governor Taseer, a matter of weeks later, were both murdered by their own protection people, as I recall. And they were murdered because they had been advocating the repeal of the legislation about blasphemy. And you could hardly have a sharper illustration of how fraught and how dangerous that whole topic has become. Needless to say, the possibility of any major politician really acting on the matter and repealing that legislation evaporated. So that legislation is still there, and there's even been discussion of reinforcing it. So that's a very, very harsh reminder of the practical realities of some of these matters, even for people at a very high level in the countries affected.
Quick comment about that. In Nigeria, members of the North tribe and areas there that have actually tried to have a more positive dialogue with the Christian community in Nigeria have also been assassinated. And so there is this issue about those that are most likely to help reconcile these differences may end up being targeted just for that effort. But now you are going to talk about the broader interfaith work that you've been doing.
The two dimensions there, first of all, with the World Economic Forum, that really has its roots in the desire of the forum to engage all the aspects of the global world. And Klaus Schwab was very clear that post 9/11, it was a factor of major importance, namely religion, that needed to be accommodated. So they wanted a religious leader group, which they developed, and then wanted to look at a West Islamic dialogue specifically. Even the name, of course, was highly problematic, because in the one sense there you've got a geographic entity and the other is a religious entity, and that it's saying quite a lot about the two sides. One was happy to be, in a sense, categorized that way. The West was very uncomfortable about how we could identify what a religious leader corresponding thing would be. So in any case, we came up with the West Islamic framing, and we put up with it, even though we knew it was unfortunate. But again, being the forum, they wanted to have representatives from different constituencies, while also religious. So it wasn't just the religious leaders. We had business leaders, thought leaders or academics. We had media people, which was very important, as well as public figures. And that made for a very interesting mix, because here you had representatives from different sectors of the community united in their engagement upon the significance of religious issues. And that, I think, was a very distinctive aspect that the forum brought to these proceedings, together with, of course, a capacity to look very hard and to engage in concrete ways. We had an education initiative, and we explored that particularly in Jordan, but we also looked at how we could facilitate rapid response by global religious leaders and indeed local religious leaders when you had a flashpoint. That's quite difficult to do. One of the challenges, if you're trying to do that and you want to issue a text condemning a particular action, is that all your religious leaders have to agree upon it, and getting the logistics of that done quickly is notoriously difficult. Nonetheless, as I say, we did get significant media coverage. We covered two aspects that I think are very important in this sphere, as emerge very prominently from this. One would be education. What do we teach in schools about the other? And the other would, the further issue was going to be how media reports stories. I'm certainly not in favor of any kind of tampering with media and trying to manipulate it, but there is a sense in which it is important to engage the media to tell the story. Usually when you have a conflict, it's important that they tell it accurately, but also there's a role in educating the general population about the issues themselves and interfaith dialogue and all of that, and getting the story out there. If you have a major meeting of interreligious leaders and so on, have an interfaith discussion, it's rather important that that story be told. And that's something which in areas where you've got a highly controlled media can be quite difficult to ensure. So as I say, those two things struck us as critical, and they remain so in my view. What you teach is critical. Coming back to the Abdallah Dialogue Center, King Abdallah Dialogue Center in Vienna, one of the more surprising things was that we were able to convene a ministerial meeting looking at what the curricula taught in the schools. And that included the Saudis. Now, by and large, you wouldn't expect that. There's been a lot of criticism of what the Saudi curricula and school books would tell you about other faiths, and it's very easy to say that that criticism was justified. One may question, as others did, whether the setting forth of a review process would mean that that automatically got changed, to which the answer would be probably automatically no, but it did begin to establish a benchmark and some level of accountability whereby one could review and invite the Saudis to review what was in their own textbooks. That's again an example of the sort of practical thing you can do, which will have some really quite important effects down the line. So that's, as I say, the sort of thing that mattered. Peacemaking, peace building, response to crises, that's the sort of thing which these international encounters can assist with. And because of the resource level that can be brought to bear, you've got companies involved who will be willing to invest in that sort of thing. And if it means education and all of that, that's the sort of thing they're going to be happy to do. So I felt there were a number of very positive things that emerged. Another was the potential for student exchanges. We identified that as a priority. To get students to exchange and encounter different religious perspectives is very important. And that is actually how I first got into dealing with students and student exchanges with the Azar. We had one that was going to be with British students that has led, in fact, ultimately to a British government scholarship arrangement whereby there are students who are supported from the UK who are visiting the Azar, and potentially this can happen the other way around. And indeed, Yale had a student exchange program, which unfortunately sank because of the Arab Spring. They had a delegation of students going, and that particular initiative collapsed. But I'm looking at a further one whereby we will invite students to go from the Azar to perhaps American institutions, and from American institutions, as will indeed happen in January, to the Azar. So these are all important things. They're chipping away at a huge problem, and they may be, in one sense, perhaps modest in their initial impact, but nonetheless, they do, over time, have a cumulative impact. And the education is so critical because it affects the mindset of people in leadership for years to come.
Well, as you know, one of the agendas for our SPC trip to Nigeria is to form relationships and come up with programs and ideas of the kinds that you've been so helpful and important in creating. The one you just described, I'm very familiar with, and it's very important. And I also want to thank you, by the way, because you are helping us in arranging meetings and with religious leaders from the Anglican Church in Nigeria for our trip that we're going to be doing in 2025 in the first couple of months. And before we leave, I would like to talk with you a little bit about the issue of Christians in the West, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Western Europe, or Europe at large. And why should they care about Christians in Nigeria, in Iraq, in Egypt? And also, what is the circumstance of Christianity from your own experience in the United Kingdom and in the United States? Is there a relationship between what might be growing hostility to Christian faith in the West and what we're seeing in other parts of the world?
First of all, Christians have an obligation. We are never Christians on our own. There's a sense in which we are united in being part of the body of Christ. And therefore, in that sense, anything that affects our brethren, our sisters, brothers across the Christian world affects us. There's also a more practical one, and I think that's actually the underlying aspect that gives edge to your question when it comes to being in the West. We may feel that we are all very safe and protected and all of that, and are not going to be on the front line. I think that is beginning to become a little bit changed by recent events. There's a sense in which we begin to question whether we are as free as we once thought we were to express our views, because we obviously have an ever more aggressive, it seems, state which wants to operate with its own set of judgments and wants to then perhaps monitor what people might think, which would be in tension with the latest conventions. So if we think about areas of morality, those would seem quite now pressing, from end-of-life issues. We've just had a huge debate in the United Kingdom, and indeed the Act that's before Parliament has just been passed through its second reading, which would allow reform, as they would call it, the introduction of assisted death, euthanasia. That is something that Christians have very strong views traditionally against. We've had other cases where the traditional teaching on marriage, for example, held by Christians, has come under question as to whether it's really quite something they should be able to say in public at all, because it might be felt offensive, or even to break with certain new requirements in terms of what can be said, or hate speech. This kind of thing is now becoming a little bit of a problem. There's been a case again in the United Kingdom quite recently where there was a journalist working for the Telegraph, Alison Pearson, if I remember the name correctly, who had the police descend on her on a Sunday morning to inquire about whether she might have committed a thought crime to do with racism in some fashion. So the rise of this kind of questioning about whether historically maintained orthodox positions are now somehow at odds with the cultural norms of a secular society in the West is, I think, becoming a bit of a challenge. And I think that's quite an interesting factor. There's a more subtle sense in which you see this interacting not merely in the West, but also with, if we think about issues to do with refugees, this has come up quite a bit, which you wouldn't expect, but there's almost an ideological commitment in certain parts of what I might call the international administrative community, might be the United Nations or whatever, which want to say, well, when it comes to persecuting Christians, there's a bit of a problem here because Christians really, from a certain doctrinaire, abstract way of looking at things, are by definition oppressors. They're part of a privileged constituency, so we don't really want to process that they could be persecuted, which I find very, very strange. Whatever the evidence you might then produce, then they're not really willing to handle it because they can't handle the idea that Christian could be in this other box. It's a very defined way of looking at the world. That came up, I think, a bit when it came to refugees coming from Syria and how they got processed by the United Nations. There was certainly a perception among some of the refugees that because they were Christian, they were not going to get processed. But coming back to the Western European experience and also in America, I think the question of the legitimacy of the specifically religious voice in the public square is becoming a challenge. And that's something that we need to think about very carefully, both as a society, but also as Christians. One of the questions that comes up, and this is an interesting question for Muslims and an interesting discussion point if you want to have an interfaith discussion, even in your local church with the local mosque or the local synagogue. If you want to lay claim to a specific moral insight as a Christian, as a Muslim, which we often do, then upon what basis would you expect other people to accept it? It's a very interesting question to discuss and a very useful one to discuss, because we do want to say that our religious insights are authentic to us and that we do have them. There is a very strong sense in which Christians would want to say we have a unique moral voice. But then the question is, well, how do we ground it? And insofar as we are able to express that, upon what basis would we expect other people to pay attention to it? There are religious differences as well as points of uniformity. We're always talking about loving our neighbor, loving as ourselves, and that's the kind of thing which transcends religious divides. But there would be a sense in which, for example, Islam is quite comfortable, I think, with aspects of revenge. Christianity probably is rather less so. Turning the other cheek was more historically what we wanted to say. Not that we always did it. Christians haven't always lived up to their own ideals. But nonetheless, it's an interesting difference. Just as I would also point to the fact that Christians do speak about the possibility and indeed look forward to, as part of our faith, a redeemed world. There is a sense in which that offers a message of hope, but it also offers a way in which we can bridge that moral point I've been raising. If we ask the question, what would a redeemed world look like? While we may have a hope for it grounded in a Christian perspective, the question is one anyone is welcome to help us address. And that could provide a positive way of articulating what is by origin a unique Christian perspective, but nonetheless one that offers a way of dialogue open to all.
That's a powerful observation, and the theological hope, the hope that's been presented in how you ended that last recitation is very, very important. And I, again, thank you for being with us. With that, we've reached the end of this edition of SPC Conversations. Our guest has been Alistair Macdonald-Radcliff, the Reverend Canon. It's been wonderful talking with you.
Thank you very much. And I look forward to discussing things again, and I hope we can perhaps be provocative in useful ways to those who've listened.
Thank you. Until next time, all good wishes, and thank you for supporting our mission.